Alrighty, I think I'm going to go ahead and kick things off here, get things going. So welcome everyone to our Enterprise API First Build and Test webinar. I'm going to walk you through how we approach API First here at Postman. Just want to mention that this is a 3-part webinar series. This is the first where we'll be building and testing an API. The second one, which is scheduled for later on in April, will focus on deploying and monitoring that API. And then our third one, which will be in May, will be a go-to-market and sustainment episode. So stay tuned for that. My name is Ken Lane. I'm the Chief Evangelist here at Postman. My role here at Postman is to pay attention to the bigger picture when it comes to enterprise API strategy and help our customers understand how that fits with the product. You might also know me as API Evangelist. I've been working in the space helping enterprise organizations with their strategy for over 10 years. And I started with Postman about 6 or 7 months ago and joined the team to help continue with my storytelling and helping enterprise organizations with their enterprise API strategy. So as I was saying, every piece of software built today either uses an API or is an API. APIs are ubiquitous and making it something that everyone should be thinking about in some capacity when it comes to their business. There are 3 shifts that led to this rise. The first major one was the consumer movement, which was moving from the desktop to the mobile phone. Starting in 2007, 2008, a lot of what we knew as the web moved into our pockets and became ubiquitous as part of a piece of technology that travels with us. And then along the way, our architectural patterns started to change, and we began shifting from a monolith to a microservices approach where we're building individual APIs that do one thing and do it well, rather than just very large software. And then the third major shift was the move from on-premise to the cloud. Rather than running your own data center, we're actually running in the Amazon, Azure, or Google Cloud, making our software more ubiquitous online and available around the globe. Let's give you a little peek of what it looks like from inside here at Postman. In the last 5 years, this is the growth in API collections that we've seen. And if you're an avid Postman user, you know that each collection is full of requests that represent those API transactions that are happening on the web each day. This exponential growth has gotten us to almost 40 million collections here in 2020. Setting the stage for some exponential growth in the next decade. All of this is occurring across many industries and use cases, across many different industries. So business solutions, cloud, communications, every industry that is using the web and using technology is being impacted by APIs. All of this has led to an emergence of API-first businesses that have really led the charge when it comes to APIs and how we build software. AWS, when they first began, was just an API, and then following their lead, Twilio and Stripe and others have emerged to be API-first businesses, demonstrating how to do this well. All of this has led from a shift from API last to API first, where rather than APIs being an afterthought and something that you do after you've already built your applications or in support of your applications, more companies are following Twilio's and Stripe's lead to actually build their API first before they actually get to work on their applications, changing how we do things when it comes to software and architectural development. So to help lead these conversations here at Postman, we've been working on a reference implementation that is going to help us focus how we tell stories, how we do demos, how we do webinars like this around a common business that is something that's familiar and relevant to a lot of people. So we've started Union Fashion, which is just a basic e-commerce company that can hopefully demonstrate how API first can actually make an impact when it comes to delivering APIs and meeting their customer and business needs. So Jeff, our fictitious VP of engineering for Union Fashion, is really eager to have everything together this year when it comes to Black Friday. So he wants to kind of revamp how they're doing APIs at Union Fashion. Historically, it's really, really difficult for Jeff's team of Q&A developers, front-end developers, and back-end developers to actually coordinate and collaborate on what's going on. It's a mess. They're using wikis, they're using GitHub, they're using many different platforms and services to actually do what they do. And Jeff's hoping to adopt a more API-first approach to actually make it a little bit more coherent and organized. Through this process, Jeff is really hoping that he can streamline how ideas go from seed to actually being part of the actual production API, having a more organized and structured approach for how APIs get delivered across teams. So let's step out of the slide deck here and actually see what we can show you about this process when it comes to Postman and the other tools and services that Union Fashion are using. So I'm going to jump into Postman. And I'm going to show you a little bit about how Postman works and how Postman, most people are familiar with it as a client tool that allows you to actually make calls to APIs, debug, and troubleshoot. And that's what 90% of our customers see Postman is. Hopefully this webinar and Union Fashion can help break you out of that and show you the potential of Postman as an enterprise application tool that helps you organize, manage, build, and deliver APIs that are of a higher quality. So to get going, Jeff really wants to get his team organized and do this in a much more structured way. So Jeff is managing his team using the team management for Postman, which is part of the web infrastructure. So we've left the client tool. We're now in the dashboard. Jeff can manage his team members. He can add user slots if we need. Right now we've got 100 user slots. We don't need to add any more. So we can add new team members here at any point. Jeff can manage the settings for his teams. So just general settings like what's the name of our team, Union Fashion, what's our logo, some of the basic level stuff. If we want, when we're ready, we can publish it and make it a public profile, and we can actually have a domain and where that name and that description and our logo shows up. We can customize that domain. But more importantly, Jeff's really interested in plugging in SSO and making this a seamless integration with the single sign-on that already exists within the organization, making it so that the teams don't have to sign up for yet another account to participate in what's going on. So Jeff's using Google Auth as part of their SSO for their team, and then using the team page to manage all of those team members. As that team grows, Jeff's able to search for users and view their activity and see who's doing what and what projects they're working on through the team activity management. Jeff can also manage the roles for those users, getting in and actually defining who's a developer, who's an administrator, and what they should be doing when they're in Postman working on different APIs. Jeff can invite all the team members that he wants and make sure everyone has the access they need to do what they need to do. And at any point, Jeff can audit this, remove users, add new users, and keep the team in check, making sure everyone has access to what they need and is doing what they should be doing. Another important aspect of Postman that Jeff is using is organizing all the teams into workspaces. Workspaces is available via the web dashboard. It's also available via the client so that you can manage your teams. You can add create new teams, and you can click to manage those workspaces. To help keep things organized, Jeff has set up workspaces based upon every API that's being developed. So we have, for our e-commerce API, we have a products, we have an orders workspace where we're able to actually organize all of the artifacts, all of the teams, and all of the activities around each of our APIs that we're developing. Each workspace has its launch pad. If you're not familiar with the launch pad, it's open when you first log in. If it's not there, you can always open it, and it gives you access to many of your different workspace, your settings, as well as lessons and other things that you can be doing within your workspace. So it's a valuable asset. Workspaces give you the ability to organize your APIs, publish your APIs, and then derive collections from those APIs for different purposes. It also allows you to manage different environments that can be applied against those APIs. And then it lets you see the history of all requests that have been made across the APIs in an individual workspace, giving you visibility over what's being done and how teams are working on APIs. You can filter these collections and filter what's being displayed. And then, of course, you can invite people to any individual workspace. So it gives Jeff this really nice ability to store all of the artifacts, all the activity, and the central truth for every individual API in a single place. But Jeff knows his team, he understands it well, and they heavily use GitHub as part of their operations as well. So GitHub and Postman are the two ubiquitous tools that are part of how Jeff delivers APIs across Union Fashion. So Jeff has also set up an organization for Union Fashion, using it to help manage all the people that are involved, and then create individual repositories for every API that's being developed. And we'll talk a little bit about how these repositories and their APIs are mapped to the workspaces for each of these APIs. But Jeff's goal is to have an individual repository for each API with an organized README that lists out all of the details for each individual API and all of the resources that can be accessed for it, while also leveraging GitHub issues for anybody else to be able to offer support, submit a ticket, and gather feedback and requirements when it comes to each individual API. So all of this, the Postman teams, the workspaces, and the GitHub repos allows Jeff to organize and manage how APIs are being delivered across Union Fashion teams at scale, using two tools that developers are already using, are already familiar with, but these are allowing him to be better organized when it comes to actually doing APIs at scale across his organization. So now that he has this base platform laid out, he has an organization with all the repos for the core APIs he's looking to develop. He has the workspaces available. We'll go to the web version of this. I'm still getting used to everything moving to the web. If you aren't familiar, pretty much everything you can do in the product is starting its migration to the web. So if you want to manage workspaces, you can manage all your workspaces here, your personal and your team. And so Jeff has all of the workspaces for each of the individual services being developed, organized here, all as part of a team. So he's able to have a holistic view of what's going on across the organization here on GitHub and here within Postman, giving him two places that he can go to understand and see what's happening. Once we want to actually start developing any of these APIs, Jeff can rely on the API builder within each workspace to begin development of each individual API. Jeff's mandated that all APIs have an open API contract that define the surface area of the API. So if you're not familiar, Open API 3.0 is the next version of what formerly was known as Swagger. Swagger is the 2.0 version. And once it got admitted into the Linux Foundation, the name got changed to Open API, and the version became 3.0. So Jeff's using Open API to define every API that his team is developing, providing basic details of the overview of the API, as well as descriptions of every path and all of the details of each of those paths using Open API descriptions. So Jeff is using the Open API builder within Postman. He's using YAML. Teams could opt to use JSON, but he's choosing YAML because there's a lot of business users involved in this process, and he wants to keep things fairly intuitive and easy for business users to be able to get involved and actually participate in the API build and test process. Jeff's versioning every one of his APIs. He's able to manage the different versions here using Postman, he's using major, minor, and patch, taking advantage of semantic versioning and Postman to help manage that along the way. For each individual API, Jeff can view the changelog and actually see what's going on, helping him and other team members actually stay in tune with what's happening and what actual changes have been made to each individual API, understanding when problems arise or inconsistencies or design patterns are not applied, or just understanding what's actually going on and what teams are doing. The team's also taking advantage of comments. Each individual API has a comments tab, and you can leave inline comments that actually are referenced to each individual API. So products has its own comment thread, orders has its own comment thread, and so on and so forth. Allowing developers to come in, actually see that comment thread, check the changelog, and get up to speed on what's actually happening. But what Jeff likes the most is also being able to look at the reports. Jeff regularly comes in here and takes a look at the reporting by API and actually can see what's going on, what requests have been made, how things are operating, as well as check in at the team level and understand what's happening at the team level. So this gives Jeff the visibility that he's hoping for across all APIs and across the teams that are involved with that API development, helping him stay in tune with what's happening and keeping tabs on what's going on. So also, because we're using Open API 3 and we've chosen to sync our APIs with GitHub, all of our APIs are synced, allowing us to stay in tune on the GitHub repository. So if we go to the products repository, you'll see there is an actual products v1 here that is synced. This is the same copy that's available here in Postman. And this is a two-way sync, allowing when changes are made here, they will show up here in GitHub. And when changes are made here in GitHub, they will show up in Postman, keeping things in sync between each individual Postman client, the Postman platform, as well as GitHub, allowing these API contracts to be used in other tools and services and as part of other pipelines that may depend on these APIs, allowing Jeff to maintain central truths for each API using Postman and then keep that in sync with the rest of the organization using Postman or using GitHub and Postman sync. Jeff is using Open API as the central truth for each of these APIs. So now that he has each team adopting Open API, he's able to direct teams to derive Postman collections from that Open API truth. So each API in the API builder has the ability to generate collections. So you can actually generate a collection from this Open API, very similar to how you historically have done it by importing Open APIs to generate collections. But now you can generate them from a central truth and actually keep them in sync with this Open API rather than using just a one-time import. So Jeff has set up a pretty structured approach for how collections get generated and defined. Jeff is looking to make sure that there are requests representing every path within an Open API contract. Jeff is organizing them into collections and folders when it makes sense. He's generating them, but he's also manually tailoring and customizing and creating them whenever necessary, but always using the generate as a default to save time and keep things in sync with the Open API contract. So all of these collections are using a naming convention that Jeff has dictated. Each product should have, at least at this stage, this design and build stage, should have 3 individual collections. One's specifically for documentation, one specifically for contract testing, and then there's a third that's just generally for working and making changes. And we'll talk a little bit more about why this is shortly. So all of these collections have a purpose. They have a name. Their scope is kept pretty small rather than just being large. The goal here is we don't want to call this a microservices design approach specifically, but it is about keeping the surface area of the APIs small and very focused so that teams are not inundated with information and do not have to wade through large numbers of collections or large scopes of collections to understand what is going on with a specific API, helping keep things organized within a single workspace, a single set of well-defined, purposeful collections, all derived from a central truth using Postman. Jeff requires that all collections must have examples. So this is a Get Products Listing collection. It has an example that is stored with it, showing how this should work. And this is derived from that Open API schema at the bottom of the Open API contract. So these examples upon generation of the collection get generated, but Jeff has team members make sure that every individual request has an example, because those are being used to generate mocks, generate docs, and other important aspects of the API lifecycle that Jeff is concerned with. Jeff also encourages, even though all of these collections are well organized in workspaces and are synced and using the Postman platform, Jeff encourages team members to regularly export collections and save them locally for backup purposes if they make major changes and they have things happening, because sometimes there are team members who will step on each other's toes. But as part of our the next iteration, Jeff will be locking these down and better defining the roles, the role-based authentication for each collection, defining what team members can make changes and which team members can only do things as read-only. Jeff is also being very organized about how environments are developed, having a naming convention for how environments are created. Jeff is making sure that the base URL for any API request is stored here, so that it can be replaced with a mock URL or a development URL, and then API keys and other key value pairs are stored within environments. Jeff is requiring that there be environments for mock environments, separate ones for development and separate for production. And then he'll be working with Q&A teams to see what else is needed when it comes to staging and other things. And again, Jeff's requiring that teams regularly back up environments just to make sure that they have, when they make major changes, that they have those backups available at a local level. From each OpenAPI contract, Jeff is generating a documentation collection, but this collection is also used to mock each individual API. So Jeff can generate new mocks. He can work with existing mocks. He can grab that URL for that mock server that's generated, and then each of those API mocks that are generated, the URL is available in the environment, so that for each API call, any new mock server that is generated is automatically available for developers to be using, so that when any developer in any workspace runs a request, those examples are returned from the mock server, allowing development and iteration on each of these APIs without actually having to write any code. We haven't deployed any APIs as part of this work. All we're doing in this phase is we're designing and we're building and testing. So we're going to be building 4 or 5 different APIs when we're dependent on Postman to help us define and mock and make those APIs tangible so that teams can iterate on them without actually writing any code. Those mock servers are shared by those URLs, but then we actually can publish documentation from this collection as well. So each of our documentation collections, we can publish, choose the environment that we want to use. We can apply a custom domain if we want. We can apply some styling. And then we can decide how we want to actually share this out and whether we want to make it available for discovery to the Postman API network, which is a public directory of APIs, or as a Postman template, which is also available publicly on the Postman network, but are lesser quality, more single-use templates for specific purposes. Jeff can then publish these docs, see the actual documentation for the API that is being built, see how it works, see examples, get at language, client code scripts in different languages, and then other team members can actually run in Postman here and actually put this API to work and see how it operates without an actual API actually having been developed. So now that we have mocks and docs, we can take our testing collection. This is a contract testing collection, which is generated from our contract, our central truth here. But then instead of making these APIs available for mocking and documenting, we have them defining tests that actually help us make sure that each API request is doing and behaving as it should. This is a post request to add a new product. We want to make sure that it comes back with a status code of 201. We want to make sure that it has a body and that it's JSON, so that when we hit send and we get that response back and we look at the test results, all 3 of our tests have passed, and this is a valid example request for an add product. We can do the same for get product and get products and get an individual product. We've got a set of the same tests here, but we're looking for a different status code. And we're going a little bit further with an actual full rounding off our contract test with an actual schema validation. making sure that the product schema that gets returned is actually matches our schema here in our Open API contract too. So when I run this request, I see my tests. I've got 4 tests. I've got all of them passing because the schema is a valid schema that matches my Open API true. So Jeff is requiring that every API request have a set of tests. He's keeping that pretty simple and pretty low bar at first, just looking for proper status codes and proper responses. In this case, it's a 204 because we're updating, and there is no response because all we did was get back our 204 no content status code, verifying that it was updated, but we don't actually need to send the body back and work with it. So Jeff is making sure that all APIs have a base minimum line of testing. He's making sure that each individual API has a contract testing collection as a separate derivative of the Open API truth. So Jeff has teams create a contract test collection for each individual API, covering 100% of the surface area of that API, with a base level of tests for each API, so that this collection can be independently ran as using Postman Runner. So you can select only these APIs, choose which environment, and actually run this independently to actually test out the contract for each API to make sure it's passing and understand what's happening. Jeff also wants to ensure once this API is up and running that each collection, each contract testing can actually be monitored. And we'll go into more detail of this in our next webinar. Did I break off again? Okay, I'm getting a no, so we're good. We'll talk more about monitoring of APIs and in our next segment, but this shows a baseline for 100% surface area testing for each API that can be then run as a runner manually. It can be then run as a runner as part of Newman, which if you're not familiar with Newman, I'll jump out of the client here real quick. Newman is the open source runner. So you can take any collection that is developed in Postman and run as part of any pipeline using Newman. So that takes this collection, which is open source, and runs it externally in as part of any infrastructure. So this contract test for products can be manually run. It can be scheduled using a monitor and run on a schedule using different regions, cloud regions, or it can be run as part of any pipeline or any infrastructure using Newman, making this contract test that we create during this build and test process something that can be used throughout the lifecycle of the API. Defining this Open API or establishing this Open API as an actual contract, because just having your Open API as a machine readable contract or definition is a good start to getting you to being a contract. But until you actually test for that and make sure that everything represented in this contract is actually there, it's not truly an API contract. So these individual collections actually make it into something that can be verified at any point throughout the API lifecycle. So that makes it so that each of these APIs that we're working with, so if we go back to our dashboard here, all of these APIs in our workspaces all have individual contracts that define how they work. So I can switch from my products workspace to my orders workspace. I've got my API truth right here. I've got my contract testing. I can actually run test and make sure that that's working. And I can do that for each of my APIs for search, for users, They all have a consistent naming convention, a consistent contract and contract testing, making sure that each API that's being built is properly tested. And most importantly, Jeff and the other stakeholders and team members have visibility into when these contracts are run, when workspaces are being updated, providing an entire feedback loop that can be used to stay in tune with what's happening. If I click into the product workspace on the web here, I have full access to all of the APIs that are available in each workspace. We only have the core one for products. We have visibility into all of the collections that are available as part of this. We can see the history of runs for all of those collections and requests. We can manage all of the environments and make sure that they're present and named properly. Jeff can make sure that those contracts are actually being ran on a regular schedule from the regions that are designated, and actually can monitor the status of each one. Jeff can make sure that there's mock servers, and then view activity across the entire workspace to actually see what individual team members are up to, understanding every step they've taken in the workspace, what they've been working on, what they haven't been working on by each day, and allowing Jeff to filter that activity and see what's happening. And this is just for the products workspace. If Jeff wants to switch that and look at the orders workspace, he can dive in and take a look. And then, of course, he can do that in a more comprehensive way using the reporting and getting at summarized reporting across each API. And that makes it easy for Jeff to stay in tune with what's happening across teams, audit what's going on, keep in tune, and have visibility into who's doing what. Someone's not on mute on the group. Check your mute button. And so that is really what Jeff was looking for here as part of his efforts. He wanted a single place that he could go and understand what's going on with each individual API. So he can land on each individual GitHub repo. He can click to the workspace for a team. He can go to the repo, see the APIs, see each individual collection, see each environment, understand them, grab the mock server URL, visit the documentation, visit any support issues that have rose up using GitHub issues, and then stay in tune and communicate with the teams using the comments for the API, but more importantly, be able to tune into the history and activity that allows him to stay in tune in a synchronized way with what teams are doing without those teams having to actually communicate and do any extra work. All they got to do is just stay busy and do what they do. And then actually make sure that the testing is occurring and that each contract is being monitored. So this really ensures that Jeff's able to get to achieve his goals for build and test for not just a single API, but for all of the APIs, users, search, baskets, orders, and products that he's looking to develop right now to support this initiative. So that concludes our demo. Let's go back to the slide deck here. Let's talk about how, let's give you a kind of geological slice of what the Postman platform is and what I just walked you through in support of meeting Jeff's goals at Union Fashion. So this is the Postman API platform, a nice slice of it showing you all of the components that I just walked you through and how they work together. So the interfaces for being able to work with Postman, most people are familiar with the desktop client. Those of you who use Newman are familiar with the CLI. I would say less people are aware of the Postman API. Because we're an API service provider, we have APIs. So most of what you can do in Postman is also available via the Postman API. allowing you to more seamlessly integrate Postman into what's happening. And then we have a whole host of different integrations. And then, of course, if you haven't visited the API network, there's quite a few APIs that are available in the Postman network for people to take advantage of. But everything with Postman, no matter what interface you're working through, really begins with the runtime. The runtime is the core engine of what is happening. It is those collections, those requests that are organized into collections that have authorization defined either at the request, the folder, or the collection level. And then, as I showed you, having examples stored for each individual request and making sure that those examples of what should be returned are present for each individual request. And then environments help us move those collections through each stage of development, whether it be development, staging, all the way into a production environment, allowing us to keep those details in order in the context of each of those stages. So the runtime is really the core engine of what you're doing with Postman. You have many requests, many collections, many environments, all working in concert to move each individual API forward. The next layer of that, which really demonstrated, is collaboration. And I showed you how you can build the teams, manage users, establish workspaces, and really manage version control and comment and the feedback loop around those APIs. So that really sets the collaboration foundation that can be scaled across the enterprise. This can be done across not just 10 or 20 users. We have hundreds of users using this across multiple teams. And this really builds in, if you approach it similar to how Jeff has approached it, with a strategy for how you organize your teams, how you define and organize your workspaces, how you break down those different bounded contexts for each of your APIs, as Jeff has with products, with orders. You can really maximize collaboration, not just collaboration, but visibility and observability into that collaboration at an enterprise scale. The next layer is really the lifecycle management layer that helps you monitor, mock, document, and manage those schemas, and then apply those tests as part of the build process. And then, because everything's defined as a machine readable collection, it can be run with a monitor, it can be run with a runner, it can be run with Newman as part of a pipeline, really making anything that you define as part of Postman orchestratable within Postman, on the Postman platform, and across your own infrastructure, so that it can be automated and orchestrated in many different ways. And then we have the enterprise layer, which really takes ups the enterprise grade of all of this. So we have the role-based access control for collections and roles for teams. I showed you the single sign-on, which makes it more seamless and frictionless to integrate your teams and manage your teams as part of Postman using your existing SSO for the enterprise. And then you have audit logs and all that observability and reporting into actually what's going on. So all of this works in concert to get you to that API first development way of life that we talked about. So this helps you begin to break down the monolith and move from that API last development, where you're actually creating organized workspaces. You're building thoughtful teams around how you're going to build APIs in those workspaces. You're defining those bounded contexts for each of your individual services as workspaces, as repositories, and you're keeping those boundaries clean and organized as you move forward, so that those APIs the scope of them don't bloat and grow as they did within a API last development world. So all of this is really getting Jeff where he wants to be. Jeff really, if the teams, the feedback from his team has been pretty good so far. They're going to start really building and iterating upon those 5 APIs that he needs to have for his goals this fall. And now they can really rapidly iterate on those APIs, get them where they need to be to meet front end Q&A and every stakeholder's goals. And so without actually having to develop and deploy an API, which we're going to do next. But within the current environment, teams are able to iterate and evolve each of the APIs to make sure they're going to meet the needs without actually writing code, without actually deploying an API. But they have the docs, they have the mocks, they have the tests, they have all of the moving parts of what an API would be doing in production, but without all the overhead of actually writing that code and doing that yet. And then the great thing is that all those tests, those contract tests, when ready, those will move into production and actually support an API, those APIs in production. But we're going to talk about that in the next edition of the webinar. So Postman, if you're familiar, Postman, all of the features that I showed you are available at the free tier for Postman. Really, where you're going to have to start considering Postman plans is when you approach the scope. You know, the number of users, the number of APIs, the scope of collaboration that you want to see, how often your teams are sharing and collaborating. So look at the team level. The business level will get you there as well. Start introducing you to single sign-on and other more enterprise features. But really, it comes down to the scope of your operations and how many APIs you're going to be developing, how many teams, and then what level of visibility and control you want across all of those teams using RBAC, using reporting and all of that, and auditing. So all these plans are available on the site. They're available from the app, and you can take a look and figure out which plan works best for you. Really, when it comes to continuing your API journey as part of this, if you want to learn more about all of the areas that I covered as part of Union Fashion, the community is where you begin. Head to communitypostman.com. We try to keep a regular stream of feature releases and announcement and information there, as well as the community. This is where people are asking questions and the Postman teams engaging with them. Definitely check out the API network. There's a lot of APIs available there. It's at explore.postman.com. You can also publish your APIs. As I showed, when you're publishing docs, you can choose to publish to the API network as an official API for your organization, or just as little templates that you want other people to be able to use that are kind of less official and less structured and organized. And then GitHub, as I showed you as part of the Union Fashion walkthrough, we're big GitHub users. Union Fashion is all done out in the open on GitHub. If you want to participate in Union Fashion, as we evolve this reference implementation, you're welcome to jump on and ask questions there. The GitHub issues are being regularly monitored, but that's just one example of how we do things at GitHub. So you can head over to our official Postman Labs organization, and you'll find our docs, you'll find collections, Newman, all of our open source tooling and processes are there. You can help us make the documentation better for Postman. And so GitHub is really your doorway to getting things done. All right, so we're coming to the close of this. I think I'm pretty much right on time. That's good. Here's a Postman survey. If you want to take a Postman survey, if you do it during the Q&A, you're going to be entered into a raffle for a $50 Amazon gift certificate. 3 lucky survey completers will receive this Amazon gift certificate, or gift card, excuse me. And if you if you can't accept the gift card for some reason, you can also talk with us, and we'll let people know that we can donate that to your charity of choice. So let us know. I'll leave this link up during the Q&A process here. Let me see. Let people know. So if there are any unanswered questions, We'll be sharing the recording with everyone in a few days, and we're going to continue answering the questions. So if you're not getting, I think we're having technical troubles with the Q&A system. Zoom's overloaded. I'm going to try to dive in and answer some questions here, but if you didn't get your question answered or part of this, stay tuned on the site. Once we process the video, we're going to be continuing to answer questions. Is there a structure that can be followed up to build a professional API that is easy to handle? So this is what we're doing with Union Fashion. It is our reference implementation. But I'll put an asterisk there. There is no single perfect way that a pattern that you can follow to deliver an API. That's what makes this game so difficult. Is there's many different ways that you can deliver an API, design, develop, and deliver. With that said, there's a lot of common patterns that you can follow. REST is a common pattern. GraphQL is a common pattern. SOAP is a common pattern. So there are common patterns that you can follow. But what we're hoping to do with Union Fashion is establish a structure, exactly what you're looking for, of a end-to-end API that works, that's designed well, and actually delivered. And when we go into the webinar, the next episode of the webinar, we're going to be talking about deployment. And part of that deployment is actually using a Postman collection to help deploy this API and create a scaffolding for how that API gets delivered. And then as part of that, we'll be developing a governance implementation to actually govern and make sure every API from orders to products are following the governance patterns that we want to see, using status codes properly, using paths properly, parameters properly. And we have a collection that helps audit that. So we have one collection to help guide each API through the lifecycle, and we have a second one that governs that API as it moves. And those exist as collections for the very same reason that I showed you why we have contract testing collections, is so that we can automate, we can monitor, we can run, and we can bake that into pipelines. And so stay tuned for the next episode. Stay tuned to Union Fashion. Union Fashion is that API structure that you're looking to find. So I'm gonna just keep scanning down is the sync page level collection level. So no, there's no sync for collections. So I'm gonna answer this live. So there is no sync for collections right now. From what I've heard, that's in the roadmap. The sync is purely for the Open API or the RAML API contract, and that is synced from one workspace to one repo, and then per version, so you can sync multiple versions to that repo. But we don't have collection level syncing yet, but that is in the works, because I've gotten that question quite a few times before, so stay tuned. So is the mock environment the place to put test APIs like a lab environment? So like most of Postman, each element, like mocks, is a Swiss Army knife. There's many different ways you can use it. So you can use it for contract testing, like I did. You can use it for other types of testing. You can use it as a sandbox. So once we move the Union Fashion API into production, you'll see that I will publish a mock environment just for the production API, not for the development process or the design first process, because I want every Union Fashion API to have a mock sandbox environment. But yeah, you could do that for a lab if you have new features coming out, early features. So as part of your development process, you could publish a mock as part of that API first. You can assign a key to it, so it's not just publicly available. And you can share that with partners and other stakeholders, or just your alpha users in your community. And that can be really a labs type approach to what's happening. And so that gives you the ability to create that mock representation and achieve what I think every API should have. Every API should have a sandbox with a virtualized mock representation of every API and for users to kick the tires and understand what's going on. So yeah, Postman's great for that. How you use it is up to you. How to define a standard workflow in collections. When I first started at Postman, I had like 600 plus collections in my personal workspace, and I had no team workspaces or other personal workspaces. And so as I worked here, I've learned to organize by workspace. I've learned to clean up, and then I've learned, as I showed as part of the webinar, naming conventions. And then I'm working on other standard conventions for how collections should be defined, how RBAC, who can read only, who can change those, and then what is the purpose of each collection, and then how many different collections you have for each API, and then what order should those API collections be developed. So I don't have a good answer for you. Like most of the API world, there's not one way of doing things, but this is why we created Union Fashion. Stay tuned for Union Fashion, because I'm going to be developing different standard workflows for collections for different teams. I'm actually going to create some bad workflows and actually show and demonstrate why why each API decision along the way might be a good one or might be a bad one. So stay tuned with Union Fashion, and we'll work on that. So after an API key gets data, I'm interested if Postman can parse it at all, or if it just collects it as a flat file and can post to a GitHub repo. Not exactly sure I follow what you're saying there, Joseph. But yeah, the recording will be up and available. But after an API plus key gets data, pre-request scripts and post-request scripts for each request, you can do a lot with it. You can grab any of the data from the response request or the response, and then I have post test scripts that take any results and publishes it to a GitHub repo. So I'll do that in a pre-request script, and I do that in a test script. So you can, even if I'm calling any other third-party API, if I'm calling Twitter API, when I get those response back, I can make a post request script that writes that response to a GitHub repository or to my environment. So how you store and how you parse is up to you. There's a lot of different ways you can do that. Can we also return code 200 for successful update? Not 100% sure. You cannot manipulate the request of the or the underlying HTTP of the request. Oh, let me, I've got a new survey link for y'all. So you have to bear with me while I go into my Slack and grab it, because it's thrown at me in Slack here. Hopefully you guys didn't say anything else in the Slack channel. Let me scroll down here, webinars. All right, here's our new link. I'm gonna just, can I display it so it's bigger? Got toolbars in the way. So here's a link right here if you guys need it. I can zoom in. I'm gonna leave that open while I answer some questions rather than read it. So let me look down. So I was just saying you can't manipulate the core request and response of it. There are certain things that are only in control of the server. So the server returns the status code. But for mocks, definitely, you can define what those status codes are going to look like. You can do any of that, but you can't manipulate the core response once it comes back from the server. Can we please do multi-seller e-commerce? Sure. That's an interesting one. I'll look at, probably be kind of once we get through the deploy and monitor and then the go to market for each API. probably moving to a multiple seller mode would be an interesting thing where people could sell their products via the union fashion and become kind of an affiliate or a partner. So I recommend, if you have any of these feature requests for union fashion, if they're actual things you would like to see implemented, go submit a GitHub issue. It's pretty easy to do. So, let me go back to Chrome here. So for the union fashion, you can find everything on the home repo, and you're welcome to submit issues and any feature requests here. But the home will get you to every individual repo, everything about the planning process, the organization, and the process that we're using. So if there's a specific approach you would like to see us address, feel free to chime in here. How and when are contracts validated by the provider? How do we make sure when and if the contract is changed and that the consumer and provider are aware? So, because your contract's stored within Postman, because your contracts are stored within GitHub, and they are versioned, and because these two are synced, you can respond to Postman changes using the Postman API, or you could respond to GitHub changes here. So if a contract has changed, you can use either the GitHub or the Postman API to answer that. Now, how that gets notified, you'll have to build into those two different, using those APIs, what the change was and whether it was a breaking change, whether it was a minor change. That's a more difficult question, and we're going to be approaching that in our next two webinar series, where we have a governance collection that will actually look for breaking changes with each change of the contract. And so you'll have to stay tuned for a little bit more of that one, of how the contract is changed and then who gets made aware of it. One thing I can say is within Postman, if you're managing your central truth, and you have collections that are defined to deliver documentation, to deliver mocks and deliver tests, you can validate those against your open API right here in your Postman. You can validate against anything that's being done within the Postman environment, but that does not notify users. So stay tuned for a future webinar, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So the question is from Raymond: how do I export just an executive summary report for management without the details using Newman? There is not a single reporter with just summary and not detail. So really this comes down to how you record the results out of each test. So let me go back to my products and look at my contract testing for products. So when you run a test, all of these get rolled up as part of your test results. You can also store things in environments here based upon the responses, either at the folder level or the collection level, or at the folder level, or each individual request. I tend to store things within the environment here from a governance perspective. So in addition to the test running and these results, I store the individual results as part of an environment. And then I'll usually add a collection at the end of the collection that takes all of those aggregate responses and publishes them to GitHub, or publishes them somewhere where then they can be, a report can be made from that. I'm also playing with using Visualizer. So how do you make that last request in here be a Visualizer summary that can then be run, and it takes the aggregate results across that and visualizes it as an executive report for someone. So stay tuned. I'll play with different ways of doing that as part of Union Fashion. One of the things that I'm really, why we created these fictitious characters and personalities, is I want to meet the needs of executive needs and get them more involved in the process. So I'll be creating a lot of collections, runs, and outputs and visuals that help speak to executives. So it really comes down to how you store the results and then how you visualize and output and store those. So stay tuned, and we'll get to more of that. Will you share the examples and collections used in today's presentations? Yes. So everything with Union Fashion is here on GitHub. I just got it to this place where the collections are to a place that I'm happy. So I'm going to publish them here. All the collections will be published as part of each services repo, and then I'll be publishing the process and the kind of governance guidelines on the home directory. So you'll be able to find everything in the home directory, and then for each individual service, you'll be able to find actual examples that you can reverse engineer. I'm probably going to do things like create separate workspaces for each service. This will probably become product development, and then I'll have a products production, because I want to create collections and workspaces that demonstrate the development workflow versus the production. And so you can stay in tune with Union Fashion to see how all this rolls out. One of the things I would like to figure out how to do, I'm still working with my team, is how can we have guests come in and work here as part of the team. So how could we maybe add people to a team and actually let you come in and actually browse what's actually happening across workspaces and be part of the actual action in here. I don't have a solution for that, but I'm going to work on that as part of the evolution. So stay tuned. Union Fashion, the reference implementation, is really the point of reference for a lot of this. How is Postman different than MuleSoft? Can Postman also help with the hosting of APIs like MuleSoft? No. Postman or MuleSoft is primarily an API management solution. So once you have an API deployed, you can secure it with keys, you can rate limit, you can publish docs. So there's one slight overlap with Postman and MuleSoft. You can publish docs with both of them. But MuleSoft is really for the deployment and management of APIs. Postman is more for the design, testing, mocking, documenting, and working with APIs, existing APIs. Postman does not deploy an API. Postman does not manage an API. But as you'll see in our next webinar, where we talk about deployment, is you can use Postman collections to deploy an API from Postman. Postman doesn't deploy it itself. You have to define the collection. So I won't have a MuleSoft API deployment, but I will have AWS API deployment and management, setting up keys, setting up access plans. And so that'll be our next webinar, which is scheduled for, I think, in 2 or 3 weeks. Stay tuned, and we'll have more on that. Is it possible to validate a database record? We don't look into your databases, but if you have an API pulling that data out of that database record, yes, you can use all of the testing mechanisms we just showed you. You can create a schema that is supposed to represent that database record, and we can validate that as it comes out the API. This is why you should not expose databases to the public world. You should only expose APIs to the public world, because databases don't have a lot of these capabilities for rate limiting, validation, testing, monitoring that APIs do. So if you have a database you want to validate, launch an API, and then Postman can validate it for you. Alrighty, I'm going to leave the rest of the questions we're going to tackle them after this. But I'm gonna call that it for this first edition of our webinar. I'm gonna pull back up the deck here, and remind everyone that this is just the first build and test, as I talked about quite often. We have a deploy and monitor session coming up towards the end of April, and then we have a go-to-market and sustainment webinar that's scheduled for May. So the next one, I'm going to actually deploy the APIs that we have here. I'm going to deploy them using AWS infrastructure. I'm going to deploy them using AWS API Gateway, Lambda, and RDS. And then we're going to monitor those APIs and make sure that all the same feedback loops exist as part of that process. So that's going to be our next one. We're going to dive into the weeds there. And then in May, we're going to actually take that API to market. And we're going to talk about how Postman can be used to sustain that API, to monitor it, and to make sure it's doing what it should. So by the end of this series, Union Fashion should be in a pretty good state when it comes to having a set of base APIs built and tested, deployed and monitored, and available for actual usage. And so we'll be doing this all out in the open on GitHub. If you have requests for features or things you would like to see in either of these webinars, submit GitHub issues on Union Fashion. I'll pull up it's pretty easy to get to. It's just github.com/unionfashion-fashion. And then you can submit GitHub issues for any of your requests here. So feel free to get them in, and I'll consider adding them before we start the next webinars. But I've got a lot of work to do before the next one, but I look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you so much. That concludes.